and going back to that young man on the shower floor with no hope, one thing that I really utilized was what matters most to me and some of my personal core values. And anyone can do this. Um, Anyone can utilize their personal core values to make those shifts without going through trauma. For me, it just happened to be trauma. And I remember being on my hands and knees and picturing 3 months out and looking at what my family could potentially look like without Sean Swarner. How would my parents be reacting? How would they feel? What would their lives look like? And I couldn't do that to them. So looking back at that, then I utilized my personal core value of family to help fight.
Sean, you're very welcome to the ScaleX Insider podcast. I am absolutely delighted and thrilled to have you on the show today.
I appreciate it, man. I'm excited for the conversation. I'm excited to see what we come up with. Since off camera, well, off recording, we discussed a lot of things, but we really haven't discussed what we're going to be doing. So I'm excited.
Brilliant. Well, look, I appreciate you getting up very early this morning from your US home and from your Canadian home, rather, and joining us this morning. So I
No,
really, really
you had it
appreciate
right.
that.
U.S. home,
US
Colorado.
home, Colorado. Okay, yes. So thank you for that. I appreciate it. It's a 6 o'clock start for you. So plenty of coffee, and we're going to have a great conversation. Look, we've been chatting off air. Our vision is to inspire, connect, and enable millions of ambitious leaders of small and medium-sized enterprises to scale with purpose. So I know scaling is something you're very familiar with. So what does scaling with purpose mean to you, Sean?
It's kind of funny because I'm thinking that scaling to me probably means a little different, something a little different than the people who are listening to this. Scaling for me, the instant you mentioned that, my mind went to scaling a mountain. But it translates back to business. It translates back to personal life in an incredible way because everyone has summits they want to conquer. You can't just magically show up at the top of the mountain without getting to base camp and taking one step at a time. And oftentimes you have to go back down. So scaling involves so many different aspects of trying to conquer the mountain, but understanding if it's you versus Mother Nature, she is going to beat you down every single time. So if you're trying to conquer the mountain, you're going to be sadly mistaken. It'll never happen. You need to learn to conquer yourself before you scale any peak.
So profound. And I love this because you have literally scaled Mount Everest amongst many other peaks and created records along the way. We use the metaphor of when people come into our community, business leaders coming into our community, of being at base camp of Scale Everest is the word that we've coined. And given their time with us, we coach them to the summit of, or certainly aim to coach them to their respective summit, whatever that may be, of Scale Everest. And we certainly, part of our essence is to do that so that they can do this with joy, flow, and ease, knowing that it's going to be challenging, but they're in business anyway, so they might as well take on a challenge that is of their making, that is purposeful in its doing. So we've teased the listeners with that. Can you share, and I know you've shared this a lot, but for the benefit of our own listeners, because it is incredible, and you can't over communicate what you've achieved. Can you share your incredible journey from being given 14 days to live to becoming the first cancer survivor atop of Mount Everest, and really, I suppose, how that has inspired your wonderful book, Becoming Unstoppable: Conquering Your Everest?
I appreciate that, and it's interesting when you were mentioning your base scale of you getting to base camp and your scale of Everest. A lot of people, they have no idea how long it takes to climb the mountain. They think you just show up at the mountain, you're at base camp, and you slowly make your way up, and like maybe 12 hours or a couple days later you're there. But I arrived at base camp April 8th, and I summited May 16th. Right. So we're talking a month and a half. You establish four different camps. You go up the mountain, drop some stuff off. You come back down with an empty backpack. You go back up with a full backpack, drop more stuff off, come back to base camp, and you rest. A lot of people would consider going back to base camp failure when it's actually regrouping. You're allowing your body to recover. You're allowing your body to make more red blood cells and hemoglobin so you're more efficient at altitude so you can actually breathe in the hypoxic air so you don't die. So you get stronger by returning to base camp. And a lot of people think, "Oh my God, I just failed." You didn't fail. You learned something. You're building yourself stronger to go back up with more fortitude, more energy, and more direction.
Yeah. Again, again, it's so profound. There's so many metaphors we're going to use today between literally scaling the summit of Everest and what business leaders have to do, during their tenure as leaders of companies who have ambition to scale whatever their respective Everest is. And it's not a linear journey as you've described. It's not a case we arrive at base camp and can we take these steps every day and we make altitude every day. Sometimes, as you say, you've got it, it's two steps forward, one step back, come back, regroup, revitalize, re-energize, and take a different path again. Tell us a little bit about, go right back to the start of this and share with our listeners the journey before you ever decided to scale these mountains across 7 continents. What inspired you to do that, given what you encountered in terms of your own personal Everest to begin with?
Absolutely, and that goes back quite a ways. And I'm assuming you don't want to go back to 9 months before I was born when my parents got together. We don't want to discuss that.
We
So
won't go back that far. I think our listeners can grasp that.
they know how that happens.
They can grasp that. Uh,
I would say let's start when I was 13 years old. I live in Colorado now, but I lived in Ohio, which is the Midwest. And literally, my backyard was a cornfield or a bean field, depending on the season. I grew up in a farming community. My dad was the only dentist in town, and oftentimes people couldn't pay the bill that he would send them. So we would have fresh vegetables year round. It became a trade and a barter. So I learned to be very giving and understanding at a young age. And I also was instilled with, I would say, proper morals and ethics as a young man. And I was a competitive swimmer. I remember my parents, well, I don't remember. My parents tell me a story, and I remember that way. They tossed me in the pool super early, and I became a competitive swimmer at about 5 or 6 years old. And I would swim down like flopping through the water, doing a 25-meter breaststroke, which was my favorite. And I would touch the wall, and mom and dad would either pull me out and they would ask me two questions. And it was, did you do your best and did you have fun? Those were the only questions I ever got asked. Not, hey, why didn't you beat Rob or why didn't you beat Steven? It was, did you have fun? And then did you do your best? And then the next weekend at the next meet, I would go on to try to beat my time from the weekend prior. And that was instilled at such a young age. And I think it helped to have that a humble winner attitude, but also not be the upset loser attitude. And that translated into when I was going back to the story, when I was 13, I suffered a knee injury that literally changed my life. If you can picture sitting at a dinner table and tearing into a piece of a chicken leg, the tendons and the ligaments just ripping off the bone. That's what my knee sounded like. And I can still hear it just snapping apart. And the knee instantly swelled up. And it was the size of a grapefruit. And I'm 13 years old. So I weighed maybe, I don't know, 80 pounds. So my legs were about this big and my knee was the size of a grapefruit. And they stuck me in the local hospital, small community. They started treating me for pneumonia. And who knew it was difficult to cure cancer by sucking on a nebulizer. So I wasn't getting any better. They stuck me in a larger hospital at the in the capital of Ohio, Columbus, Ohio, and that's when they did a ton of blood work, CAT scans, MRIs. You know, and here I am in the eighth grade, grade eight, 13 years old, and my life was changing because my family and my friends weren't in the school, they were in the hospital. You know, it was the doctors, the nurses, it was the patients became my close friends because I was diagnosed with advanced stage 4 Hodgkin's lymphoma. And they told my parents, hey, your firstborn son now has an expiration date. Oh, and that's 3 months from now. Yeah, they told my parents I was going to be dead in 3 months.
This resonates strongly. My niece is going through something similar at the moment, and she's only 6 years of age. So the this at this stage must have been hugely challenging for your parents. What was the mindset that they adopted whenever they heard that their son? Do you have any other siblings,
I
Sean?
did. I have one younger brother.
One
So
younger brother. So, but their eldest born has 3 months to live. Have you ever had that conversation with them? And what was their demeanor around you at that stage? Was it one where you could pick up their anxiety, or was it one where they were going, okay, well, we're not going to accept this, and we're going to make sure that every minute that we spend with Sean is going to be one that's filled with joy, with fun, with laughter? How was that?
interesting question because you said your niece is going through something similar, and as we all know, cancer is not an individual disease. Everyone goes through it together. And my family, it was just my mom, my dad, my brother, and myself, 3 years younger than I am. And when it first hit them, I don't think they really led on how nervous they were. Now, years later, I can look back at it and be honest when I say I think it was more difficult on them than it was on me, simply because they couldn't get in my mind and fight the cancer. They could do everything they could with the nutrition, the treatment, the physical aspects of the chemotherapy and anything that's going into my body. But as far as getting in here, they couldn't do that. And initially, they didn't tell me, hey, Sean, you have cancer. They said, hey, Sean, you're sick, but we are going to do everything we possibly can to get you better. And I wish that's how they did things now. Because imagine you're going in for a checkup and the doctor sits you down and says, hey, you have cancer. It's stage whatever, it doesn't matter. Anything after that, even if he says it's 100% curable, you've already tuned out. But the way that my parents brought it to me was, Sean, you're sick. We're going to do everything we can to get you better. You are going to get better. And oh, by the way, it's cancer. So they kind of flipped the script. And I think that was key. And they also helped me and encouraged me to do and be as normal as possible. So I love playing, as you call it, football, and as the rest of the world calls it football, but as us backwards Americans call it soccer for some reason. And my wife's born and raised in Puerto Rico, Latina, so I call it football as well. And I loved playing the game. I was mid back, and I was the only person who was allowed a handsball, not to grab the ball and move it, but because I had a Hickman catheter, which was a permanent IV sticking out of my chest, and I could use my hands to actually protect it so I wouldn't have any internal bleeding. And they encouraged me to go out there and be as normal as possible. I had a wig on, and I remember heading the ball once, and my whole wig shifted, and I was like, okay, I'm done. Because I was so embarrassed about how I looked. I was 60, 70 pounds overweight, bald from head to toe, and I was out. But my parents were always there encouraging me to go and do what I could when I could. When I felt bad, great, let it go. It will change. There are some nights and some days I would be vomiting for 36 hours straight, but I knew in my mind that it would get better. And it wasn't focusing on not dying, it was focusing on living. And I made that conscious decision when I was almost 14 years old. So very young in my life, I decided to make a conscious perspective shift on life and focus on what I wanted as opposed to the avoidance of what I didn't want.
I want to get into that. Maybe take us forward, because will you tell me, because did your mindset, did something happen that was quite inspirational, or kind of perspective shifting in your own mind, where your thought patterns were one way, uh, you were disclosed this news, and you decided that you were going to now think and feel and act and behave in a different way? Or did that kind of develop over time? So I'm really curious to understand, and for you to share with our listeners what you went through to ultimately um, to deliberately change your mindset such that you were focused on living, not kind of getting busy dying, as they say in the Shawshank Redemption. You know, that you decided to shift your energy on the solution, not focus all of your energy on the problem. And but did that happen at 14, or is that something that, and were you conscious of it at 14, or is that something that you've been deliberately developing since then?
It's interesting when you mentioned the Shawshank Redemption. It was filmed 30 minutes from where I had my treatments in Ohio, and my friend's dad was an extra. He was an extra in the shower scene. So if you're interested in seeing my friend's dad's butt, you can watch that movie again. But look, looking at, and it was so funny because he was like, "That's my dad's butt."
uh,
But
my dad starred in the Shawshank Redemption. Oh my goodness. Yeah.
but let's just imagine, for example, whoever's listening to this, you, for example, you're diagnosed with cancer. What choices do you really have? You could fight for your life or give up and die. And it's really not a choice. Theoretically it is, but who in their right mind is just going to give up and die? Who's just going to roll over and say, I've had enough at 14 years old? I had my whole future ahead of me. So you asked me if it was a shift in thoughts over time, or if there's something was that happened. I do remember being on the bottom of the shower floor, and before I went into the shower, I remember going into the mirror, into the bathroom, or as you call it, the water closet, going into the WC and looking at myself in the mirror and literally not being able to recognize who was looking back at me. Yeah, I was 60, 70 pounds overweight. My hair was just literally falling out in clumps, and there was nothing left. There was no hope. There was no fire. There was nothing. And that's when I just kind of slumped into the bathroom, or into the shower, and I turned the water on and I fell to my hands and knees and I started sobbing. The water was filling up in the shower because my hair was clogging the drain. So I had to pull the clumps of hair out of the drain. And I started thinking about what my friends were doing when that same morning when they were getting ready for school. When you were in the grade 8, when you were 13, 14 years old, what were you worried about? What was going through your mind when you were getting ready for school? Girls, maybe where are you going to sit at lunchtime? And those things cause a lot of people anxiety. My anxiety stemmed from potentially not waking up the next morning.
So was that a defining moment for you in terms of deciding, when you came out of that shower that day, that this isn't how you weren't going to concede to what had just been disclosed to you? You weren't going to give up here. You were going to change perspective in some way. Was that a defining moment? Do you recall a defining moment? Was it a case of, I have to go to rock bottom before I start climbing back up again? Can you share a little bit of that? Because what I'm keen to do, Sean, for our listeners, is ultimately, I feel anyway, that a lot of people wait for trauma in their lives to enact change, change in their thinking, change in their behaviors, change in their habits, change in their attitudes, which ultimately then changes positively the trajectory of their lives. But they wait on the trauma before they do that. Now you're 14, you're a young guy, you're living your life. You didn't, you haven't got into adulthood. You're not thinking about the I suppose the bigger adult stuff. But by the same token, the I what I'm keen to do is ultimately map the mindset that you have embodied and that you have um, developed to say to people, don't wait on trauma before you enact change, because this is a mindset shift. Sean was the same person, but decided that he wasn't going to concede, that he was going to battle this and come out the other end victorious. Can you share a little bit about the development of that mindset, and does that resonate in terms of the people that you encounter waiting on trauma before they change?
Yeah, absolutely. And we can use trauma to initiate change, but we can also be mindful of it without change or without the trauma. So it's sad that I went through what I went through, but it was a development over time. And going back to that young man on the shower floor with no hope, one thing that I really utilized was what matters most to me and some of my personal core values. And anyone can do this. Um, Anyone can utilize their personal core values to make those shifts without going through trauma. For me, it just happened to be trauma. And I remember being on my hands and knees and picturing 3 months out and looking at what my family could potentially look like without Sean Swarner. How would my parents be reacting? How would they feel? What would their lives look like? And I couldn't do that to them. So looking back at that, then I utilized my personal core value of family to help fight because I didn't want them to lose their firstborn son. And I think we can all do that if we're mindful of the choices and decisions we're making, and we make choices based on what we value most, which are our personal core values. And a lot of people haven't ever taken time, not out of their day or their week, their months, out of their lives to figure out what their personal core values are. And once you do that, you can start making mindful decisions and slowly making your way up whatever peak you want to climb in your life. And going back to the mountain, there are how many different routes up Everest? How many different routes up Kilimanjaro? How many different routes up any mountain to get where you want to go to reach your goal or your destination? Pick the one that suits your ability and your skill set. It's the same thing going after your goals in life. Pick something, you have a goal, you have a desire, you have a dream, you have the summit you want to reach. Utilize your own personal core values to empower yourself to find your own route to make it.
On the core values, I love this, choose your own summit and align that summit to your unique strengths, your unique ability, your unique talents, but anchor it in your own personal core values. I'm always keen for our listeners to be able to take practical tactics away from the podcast whenever they've invested the time in listening. What would you say to those who are listening who haven't taken that time to discern their core values? What could they do, 10 minutes after listening to this podcast today? How could they begin to discern what their core values are, which will ultimately, what I'm hearing, is help direct and inform and provide them with the how in terms of choosing the summit which they wish to scale?
Absolutely. I would suggest 10 minutes after hearing this, reach out to you to get a code to get half off of what I call my Big Hill Challenge.
Well, we'll definitely put a link to this in the show notes. Brilliant. I love that, Sean.
It's interesting. Like it's not even live yet. I have the website, thebighillchallenge.com, but I couldn't find what you mentioned. I couldn't find what I was looking for. So I created it myself. It's very similar to when I was trying to climb Everest. No one believed it was possible for a one lung guy to physiologically make it to the top of the world. So when I reached out to corporations, they're like, no, no, no for sponsorship.
Yeah.
They just closed the doors. So I rethought and looked at it from a different perspective. And as opposed to going after the companies who manufactured and created the outdoor garments, I went to the company who actually made the fabric for those garments. Gore-Tex. I reached out to Gore-Tex, and Gore-Tex said, "Hey, we'll sponsor you. Who would you like as an introduction to?" So that's the way I looked at it. So as opposed to doing what everybody else was doing, I couldn't find that. I couldn't get any traction. So I created my own core values assessment. And a lot of people go through and they have cards, this value, and they put down a stack of what they value. And I'm not interested in security. I'm not interested in appreciation. I'm interested in freedom. I'm interested in family, personal growth, those sort of things. And now they have a stack of personal core values. That's where most people stop. But in the core values assessment I created, I then actually have people go and rate how they're living those core values on a scale of 1 to 10. 1 being not at all, 10 being full out, 100%. And the first time I ever did this, and it's deep. It's a very difficult thing to do, but you have to be honest with yourself. And the first time I did it, family. Oh, that's one of my personal core values. And I remember writing it down in my journal. I also created a journal and I wrote it down. And I'm honest with myself. I'm living family at about a 5 or 6. That hit me on it hit me on an emotional level. Like if I value family so much, and I'm telling everybody else I value family so much, but inside I'm actually living it at a 5 or a 6 on a scale of 1 to 10, then I'm living a fake life as far as I'm concerned. It's not true to who I really am. But I saw that as an opportunity now to feed into family to create that stronger core value. So now I call my grandma, who's 101 years old. I
Wow.
call her once a week. I call my dad all the time. I call my mom all the time. I support my brother. I support my in-laws. I call them my outlaws, but I call them my in-laws. I'm feeding into those things, and I have a list of them here on my computer that I want to constantly focus on every single day. Now, going back to your initial question about how do you do that on a linear progress, you start doing that day by day by day by day by day. Now you're utilizing the compound effect to increase your your wherewithal of what matters most to you, to increase yourself, because you can't pour from an empty cup. You have to take care of yourself first. Now you're building yourself so you can give to others.
A couple of things, and I want to come back to that, the importance of compounding. And again, your language strongly resonates. I think it was Dr. Jim Lear, who we had on the podcast, coined the phrase of uh, CEO stands for Chief Energy Officer, not Chief Executive Officer. And that the importance, as you say, of filling your own personal cup every day, leading self first before you lead others, before you lead an organization. I want to pick at something a moment, because this will resonate strongly with our listeners. You mentioned right at the outset, it was incredible, the being away for a month and a half to scale Everest. Now, clearly, you were away from your family, or maybe I'm making an assumption here, but away from your family for that period of time. So, a lots of our listeners who are leaders of businesses will value their family. When you ask, I ask this question all the time. They'll say family and health. I'd say, show me your calendar. And of course, family and health don't typically feature in their calendar, but they'll say family and health. So you're away from your family for 6 weeks. Which of your values were you living out in order to actually waking up day after day after day in this brutal environment, in the wilderness with no family around to actually get to the summit of Scale Everest? What was driving you there in your core values?
Yeah, what would first of all, I had a satellite phone, so I connected with them quite frequently, my family. So that was still being built. But the personal core values that I would be feeding on Everest and going up into these mountains would be personal growth, success, freedom, security, appreciation, adventure, those sorts of things. But then now looking back at it, my goal was to reach the summit of Mount Everest and inspire other people along the way. Because the entire time I was climbing, I had a flag that had names of people touched by cancer folded up in my chest pocket close to my heart. So it wasn't just for myself. But one thing I didn't realize, looking back at it, hindsight being 2020, when I made it to the summit, I was only halfway. I had to get back down.
Yeah.
Most people don't realize that. But then I also realized after you climb and make it to the top of any mountain, there are going to be other peaks to summit, other mountains to climb, and it's interesting because if you look at how long I spent on the summit, 20 minutes, 30 minutes, compared to the amount of time and effort and energy put into trying to reach that 20 or 30 minutes, you can't even compare. So you have to learn how to enjoy the journey along the way, enjoy every step. Is it going to be fun and all the time? Absolutely not. But there's something else that you mentioned too, that the chief energy officer. I wrote this down because every day I wake up, I picture myself having an energy ATM. And throughout the day, am I making deposits or am I constantly making withdrawals?
I love that. I love that. And in the context of compounding, because I had this question yesterday where it was one of our team members actually has a morning routine, and it includes going for a run, and preceding that is stretching. And she was getting a little bit frustrated because the last few mornings she didn't get to do her stretching, and said, how should I deal with that? We were chatting about psyche, which is the very first principle of our 10 principle ScaleX framework. He said, how do I deal with that? Because already before I go for the run, I'm frustrated because I don't have the time and I haven't done my stretches. And we use that exact analogy that but you've stretched, for 3 weeks in a row prior. So you've made lots of deposits in your energy ATM. Some days it's fine to make a few withdrawals. Tell me about your experience. What does your day look like in terms of you making deposits from a psyche perspective, from a mental perspective, from a physical perspective, from an emotional perspective? What are some things now, Sean, for you that are non-negotiable?
One of the things that's non-negotiable for me is understanding that we create our own time. We make time in our lives, and people don't understand that. Like, what do you mean you create time? Let's say you're in your office at home. Your son comes in and says, "Dad, let's kick the football around." Like, I don't have time for that. I'm busy. Same scenario. Son comes in and says, "Dad, I just stepped on a rusty nail." You're going to ask, "Sorry, I don't have time for that." No, you create time for what matters to you most. So the lady you're mentioning, I don't have time to stretch. She needs to create the time for things that are important to her. And I think people need to understand that every morning we wake up, we only have 24 hours, and have 8 hours of that, eight to whatever, however long you sleep, you have X number of hours in the day. What are you going to fill those with? For me, the instant I open up, or the instant I wake up and my eyes open, I tell myself, yesterday's gone, there's nothing I can do about it. Tomorrow may never come. No matter what happens today is the best day ever. And I tell my wife in Spanish, hoy es el mejor día de todo. because she's from Puerto Rico. And I tell her too in Spanish. Like that way we both totally understand. And on the way out of our bedroom, I have a sheet of paper I printed up, and it literally says, like steps. One, before I even leave the bedroom, take a deep breath. Take another deep breath. Put a smile on your face and read the following with emotion and conviction. And it says, I am strong. I am confident. I am strong. I am confident. I am strong. I am confident. Lists it 14 times, which represents the 14 steps that I have to take to go downstairs. And I repeat those in my mind with each step I take down. I'm strong. I'm confident. I'm strong. I'm confident. So that sets the mindset for the rest of the day. I don't touch my phone for the first 30 minutes of waking up because I want to program my day and I want to program my mind. I don't want it to be programmed by external sources. I want to put myself in a state of mind where I know I can react to ways in the way I want to and the way that's best for me, as opposed to instantly reacting, oh my God, what am I going to do? No, I have to put out this fire, put out the, no, 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 no. Me first. I need to load up my energy ATM so I can start pouring to other people. But then we do yoga. Actually, let me back up. Normally we wake up at 6 a.m. All that happens, we go down to the kitchen. I make a little cup of coffee. She has we make homemade ginger tea where we blend up ginger and boil it. It's amazing. Put some honey in there, some turmeric. Then we sit down in the living room and we talk about three to four things we're grateful for, how we're going to tackle the day, and certain things that we want to do together. Then we go do yoga. Then we have breakfast. And breakfast can be anything from overnight oats to what we call cream of wheat or farina, depending on where you are. And then we start our days. But we mindfully and consciously and purposefully start our days the way we want, not the way others potentially want for us.
Yeah, I'm a big believer in winning the morning, win the day, you know, and before you let the world in on you, and the moment you open social media, you're letting, it's equivalent kind of letting tens of thousands of people into your bedroom. And you've no idea what they're going to do once they're in there in terms of the havoc that they might create and how they're going to trigger your mind in certain ways. You know, you're a guy who has overcome such incredible traumas within your life, and then you've created these challenges for yourself. There's lots of people out there who will talk about affirmations and will rubbish affirmations as well. But you're the living embodiment of someone who has programmed their mind to live rather than kind of letting the negativity in, which is conducive to dying. And I think there's a lot of people who waking up every day numb to this idea that they can deliberately create the life that they want to live. Can you speak to that in terms of the inner dialogue? And I suppose to give some context to that, I was interviewing Dr. John Rhodes, who is a cognitive psychologist, and he cited this stat that 80% of our thoughts are negative and 95% of our thoughts are recycled from the previous day. Is that something that resonates with you, or are you one of these superhumans, Sean, who kind of doesn't have this negative inner dialogue? Can you share a little bit of what's going on inside that head and how you create your own dialogue?
It's interesting. I didn't realize 95% of the thoughts are recycled from the previous day. That just goes back to the compound effect. And if you look at, let's just hypothetically say a glass of water represents thoughts, your mind. Dirty water represents negative thoughts. Clean water represents positive thoughts. If you have a glass of dirty water, you stick it under the spigot and you turn on the water and constantly flush it with clean water, what's going to happen to that glass of dirty water? Same thing with your brain. If we're, who do you talk to more than anyone else throughout the day?
Yourself.
Yourself. And if 80% of those thoughts are negative, would you be friends with someone who's that negative to you? why do you do it to yourself? So it does happen, and I'm guilty of it as well. But I also realize that a lot of those negative thoughts stem from what I call my gremlin. And I've named my gremlin. His name is Cooper, and I know it sounds really weird. Next thing I know I'm gonna look out there and there's gonna be a couple black cars with tinted windows. They're coming with a straight jacket that's gonna haul me away.
Uh,
But I call him Cooper, and I am very mindful and aware of when he shows his ugly head. It's like the devil and the angel, chirping in your ear. And it usually happens when I become nervous about something. It's like, oh, you're not strong enough for that. You don't have enough experience. You're not smart enough. You're not wealthy enough. You don't have this. You don't have that. And I realize, first of all, I recognize that it's happening. I'm like, okay, it's just thoughts, right? It's not going to cause any damage. But then I realized that those thoughts came from somewhere. And at some point in my life, they were there to protect me. And it was probably my mom and my dad. Every time you get in a car, hey, be safe. Don't get into an accident. Whatever it might be when you're driving the car, when you're 16, be safe. You don't drive crazy. Those thoughts get in there, but they were there at some point to protect you. And now I realize Cooper's chirping in my ear. I'm like, hey, listen, dude, we are working together. We both want what's best for me. Let's make it happen. So that way we don't have to be nervous. And I also realized a long time ago that when you get nervous, when the human body physiologically gets nervous, what happens? Your palms start sweating. You might have some ringing in your ears. You start breathing through your upper chest. Your respiratory rate goes up. Your pulse rate goes up. What happens physiologically when you get excited about something? Same response. So as soon as I realize and I'm paying attention, I start to breathe a little up through my upper chest. My respiratory rate goes up. I look at my watch. I have a Garmin watch. It tells me my pulse rate. It records everything, I'm sure. And I realize, oh wait, I'm not getting anxious. I'm getting excited. And you can turn it around. But you have to pay attention to that internal dialogue because that's where the whole process begins.
yeah, again, regular listeners to the podcast will be very, very aware of the focus that we put on psyche. I believe it either will empower the other 9 principles of scaling or disempower. It either acts as a multiplier or a divisor of the efficacy, the impact of all of the other 9 principles. So it's really what I'm hearing. It's thinking about your thinking. It's becoming self-aware that we all have our own Cooper. There's none of us. There's none of us gets away here. We all have our own Cooper, and our own Cooper is typically wired to keep us safe, but can be overly anxious in the context of what represents an actual danger and what is a perceived danger. And in terms of that self-awareness piece, Sean, what do you do? You mentioned yoga. What else do you do to keep Cooper on side?
Every time I mention Cooper, people are just that's weird. You know, it, it goes back to focusing on what you want to focus on over time. If you're constantly a negative Nancy, and if I offended any Nancys out there, my apologies. But if you're a negative Nancy and it's something that's constantly on your mind, you have to be aware of that. We as human beings are a representation of repetition, right? And there's a saying, you are what you eat. But in all actuality, you are what you consume. So if you're constantly consuming negativity, you're going to be a negative person. If you're constantly bombarded by negativity from, say, the top 5 friends that you surround yourself with, if they're not supportive and they're not constantly pushing you and pulling you and dragging you up to the top of your peak, then you're going to be negative. So one of the things I do is I'm not on social media most to consume. I create. I create more than I consume. I don't get lost in the constant mindless scrolling. Whenever I catch myself doing that and I'm going down that dark, deep rabbit hole, I'll pick up my learning Spanish app and I'll create something else in here. But one of the big things that I focus on every evening in my journal is I write down, and I think this really will help a lot of people too. The majority of human beings go to sleep and they're worried about everything they have to do tomorrow. They're focused on berating themselves for everything they didn't accomplish today. And oh my God, I can't believe I didn't do that. I did you hear what happened to Susie the other day? Just constantly going through their minds, this negativity going boom, 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 bad, bad, bad. You're now going to bed with this anxious feeling, as opposed to what I do is in my journal, I write down 5 things I'm grateful for that happened that day. Right. So focusing on gratitude. And I journal, not I'm grateful for family, friends, my health. That's a given. 5 specific things that happened that day for which I'm grateful. And then I journal about one of them. I'm most grateful for blank because blank. And that connecting word helps it go back to my personal core values, which I'm trying to feed into anyhow. So it's all interrelated. Now I'm going to bed as opposed to feeling anxious and worried about tomorrow. I'm literally going to bed with an attitude of gratitude. And I think that really helps.
I love that. It's a practice that I do myself. Bookend the day. I open up the day. I have a journal on a wonderful tablet called a Remarkable.
Mhm.
Amazing device because I used to fill journals after journals. So the Remarkable is an electronic journal. I downloaded a wonderful planner a number of years ago from Etsy, and I begin the day with 3 gratitudes, and I end the day with 3 wins. I haven't heard of the practice. I love that, and it's something I'm going to actually start in my own journaling practice. Is actually just elaborate on one of those wins, one of those things that I've teased out as being a success during the day, to explore how that actually um, threads back, aligns back to one of my own personal core values. And then that reaffirmation practice, what I'm hearing here is the reaffirmation of your personal core values ultimately creates helps to create this positive programming within the mind, which actually helps to get our own personal Coopers on side, which keeps us focused on our own goals. And I love the fact that you've called out the kind of your own gremlin as Cooper. And I think, it's something I'm keen to hear from yourself, Sean, is that, do you feel that, and clearly you do, that practice of giving it a name, giving the negative Nancy, the gremlin that is Cooper, calling our own respective Coopers out, labeling it, and whenever we start to kind of hear that inner dialogue, that negative inner dialogue on repeat, actually calling it out for what it is. Do you find that has been a game changer for you in terms of actually labeling this and then having the conversation to get this gremlin on side?
It really has helped a lot. And I think more than anything, when those negative thoughts come in, it helps me acknowledge and validate. So I acknowledge that they're there and I validate that they're legitimate, but then I realize that's all they are, thoughts. It's very similar to when people have a panic attack or when they get anxious or nervous. The harder you try, the worse it gets. It's like laying in bed trying harder to go to sleep. It doesn't work. But if you acknowledge and validate, okay, yes, it's happening. This is why it's happening. And I appreciate that it's happening. And then you let it go, that's fine. But the harder you go to sleep, it doesn't work that way. Stop being so anxious. It's not going to happen. So I think having Cooper may help me acknowledge and validate the fact that I may have these anxious thoughts. But over time, Yeah, I don't have them anymore, really.
You speak about the importance of kind of overcoming limiting beliefs. And just to share with you a statistic, lack of ambition of the leader is cited as the single greatest impediment as to why companies don't scale. Now, why is scaling important? In the context of the UK, there are 5.6 million small to medium sized enterprises in the UK, and they're contributing £2.3 trillion worth of revenue to the UK economy. 1.3 trillion of that is coming from 28,000 companies who are scaling. Now, those are small to medium sized businesses. We're not talking about the Googles and the Amazons here. We're talking about small to medium sized businesses. And for the remainder, we're saying that actually it's that lack of ambition of the leader which is holding them back from and denying them the opportunity to fulfill their potential, the potential of their teams, the potential of the organization, and ultimately create a positive ripple and a positive impact within their community, society, and economies at large. This is why I'm kind of fascinated and inspired by your story, and really, I I like to get under the lid of how limiting beliefs show up, and how we can avoid trauma in our lives before we actually start to lift the lid on these limiting beliefs. We were chatting about Wim Hof earlier. Is this wonderful line that the limit is not the sky, the limit is the mind. So just coming to limiting beliefs, because if we can move the dial, and I assert that when you lift the lid on kind of lack of ambition of the leader, that translates into a couple of things. One is kind of ignorance. They don't know how, and the ScaleX 10 principle framework is a way of giving them the knowledge of how. And then there's the other side of this, which is unchallenged limiting beliefs. Given your work with leaders across the globe, what do the limiting beliefs typically look like? How do they show up in the leaders that you're coaching, the leaders that come into your community, so that we can kind of call these out for what they are?
It's interesting, and never really thought about it until now. One, a lot of people have no idea. They have no concept of the difference between a million, billion, and a trillion. The brain just can't comprehend that. So I believe if you look at something that you can understand, seconds, I think a million seconds is roughly 11 days. A billion seconds is 36 years. A trillion seconds, I believe, is roughly 36,000 years. That's the difference between a million, a billion, and a trillion. Put into something that we can understand, as opposed to some, like, I will never make $1 billion. I don't even know what that looks like. And then you look at the companies who are making, which is $1.3 trillion. Unbelievable. But putting it in that aspect, and then looking at the leaders who are in charge of those companies, I'm wondering if it's not necessarily the lack of ambition, but it's their egos getting in the way because they're afraid they're going to be judged and they're afraid of failure. So, as opposed to actually going out there and empowering their employees, empowering their force, they're sitting there being afraid to move forward, which comes across as this lack of ambition.
Again, yeah, we see this all of the time in terms of fear of failure, fear of judgment, and in some instances, fear of success. Because they don't want to
Yeah.
overshadow maybe a founding father, or some of the other entrepreneurs in the community that they've grown up in. But certainly, fear of failure shows up a lot. What would you say to those who? I think this will resonate with everyone listening. We all have this fear, I feel, of judgment. We all have this fear of failure. What can people practically do who are listening to this to combat this fear of failure, this fear of judgment? What we've talked about, kind of anchoring your motivation and aligning it to your personal values. what else can we do to mitigate the limiting voice of failure, that limiting voice of judgment? How do we kind of get ourselves over that?
You know, I have never made it to the summit of any significant peak by myself. Going through the cancers, I had my family, I had the doctors, I had the nurses, I had the cancer charities. Going up Everest, I had the Sherpas, I had the icefall doctors. Going up Kilimanjaro, I have a local group, I've the guides, the porters, I've used 23 times the same guides, the same porters. They adopted me into their Chugga tribe. They gave me a Swahili name, which is Mzungu Kicha, which translates to crazy white man in Swahili. So
That's probably about right.
it's about right. And I've always had a team in place. And let's hypothetically say I climb a mountain, proverbial, literal, whatever. Let's say I make it to the top by myself. Yay, self high five. Congratulations, patting myself on the back. That's ego speaking. But I've never made it up to the top without a team. And I think one of the biggest things is realizing you don't just inspire, you don't just motivate, you empower. You empower people by leading from behind. If you're out front with a flag, oh, follow me, everybody, I know the way. That's ego. When it's dangerous, yes, on the mountain, hey, put your foot here, put your hand here, step there, do this. But 99.9% of the time, I'm the last person in the group empowering and encouraging people, leading from behind. I'm keeping an eye on them because I don't want anyone to fall off the mountain. I'll rush up there and make sure they don't die. But it translates very well because if you're at the back of the pack, encouraging others to go, you're not just inspiring and motivating, you're empowering. But you have to empower them based on what they value, not what you value. So once you know what your employees value, once you know what your team values, each individual, you can encourage them with tough love, or you can encourage them with gentle kindness, whatever they need. So a leader has to become a chameleon of sorts to adapt into whatever situation it might be, doing what's best for the team, not what's best for the individual. A perfect example is the last trip we were on the mountain on Kilimanjaro. I made the probably one of the toughest decisions I've made in the mountains. I wasn't feeling well. I turned myself around. Ego would have continued pushing me forward. But I knew that if I continued forward, I wouldn't be an asset for the team. I would have been a liability. So I realized that they were with a good team, they were with a good leader, they were with good locals that I trust. I put the right team in the right place. I went back down the mountain. They went up in 100% success. But I think the biggest thing is removing that ego and encouraging and empowering others.
And it's back to that self-awareness again, that awareness of self to say, well, is this, oh, there's a saying that ego is a wonderful servant but a horrible master. It's that discernment when it's becoming the master as opposed to the servant, and having that self-awareness to understand that it's time to turn around and go back here because it's dangerous for myself, for others, but actually that leading from the back, that leading from behind, I love that. Something that we haven't spoke specifically to is the goals that you've set in themselves. I mean, you've climbed the highest peak in each of the 7 continents. Just incredible. You don't have to set these goals. There's no there's no, I suspect, monetary reward at the top here where you cash in a check when you get to the peak. You've decided to set these goals. And again, this is within the gift of every leader listening. It's within their gift to set goals or not. What would you say to leaders in the context of the importance of goal setting?
Goal setting is it's very important because you have to know if you're successful or not. But also, well, we could go in so many different directions with this. Instead of focusing on success, focus on constantly succeeding. Because once you reach the summit of one peak, there are going to be other mountains to climb. I mentioned that before. But having those goals almost becomes a true north for you. So you know which direction to go. But you also have to know where you are now before you know where you're going to take your first step. So you have to do that internal work. I've worked with so many people in the past that are very successful billionaires, 36 years type people, the multi-billionaires who had from the outside everything in place. But they at some point in their lives, they had to turn around to do that self-work. They ignored themselves and just constantly built their empire. It doesn't work. On the outside, they have everything. Inside, they're broken. They're a mess. But having that self-awareness of turning around and working on what matters most to you is something everyone needs to do. But you have to understand whatever goal you're reaching for, why are you doing it? What does a summit represent? What does a new car represent to you? What does the increase in salary mean? The new car is going to rust and get old. You're going to have more money, as they say in the States, mo money, mo problems. You, you have to understand why you're doing it. And it goes back to what we initially discussed, personal core values. I was working with a guy at a mastermind. It was a billionaire mastermind. And I was up on stage being interviewed, and I looked at the guy who was a friend of mine, and he has 3 private jets, 200 cars, 50 houses around the world. And I stopped during the interview and I looked at him. I was like, Vic, why are you here? He's like, what do you mean? I'm here to network. It's like, but why? It's like, to make money. I was like, you have more money than God. Like, what else could you possibly want? Like, why are you here? So we slowly started peeling back these layers. And then he thought about it for a bit. He's like, I think I'm here to provide a comfortable life for my family. I was like, there you go. You're not here to network. That becomes the vehicle of why you're actually here. You're here because you want to take care of your family. Now, I'll argue that he already had enough to take care of his family, but in his mind, that was an initial start. So once you have those goals in mind, which are very important, they give you a direction, but you have to know where you are and why you're going for it.
And how do you know that the goal you've set is ultimately the right goal, given this one life that we have? How do we discern, should it be this mountain or this mountain?
I'll answer that. Does that goal scare the shit out of you?
So if the answer is yes to that, is that the one we should go
Yeah.
for? Lovely. I love that, and what a great way to bring this to a close. So ultimately, we should be setting goals that absolutely scare the shit out of us, that are going to challenge us in every which way. That this is a journey of self-discovery in many ways, one which we're going to learn a lot about ourselves, but one that we should do with others, and understanding that, to use that cliche, if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. And and in and in going for those big goals, there are daily practices and routines and rituals that we can embed that are going to compound over time, that's going to provide the resilience, um, and the mental fortitude to support us in getting there. Before we move into the final questions, Sean, is there anything that you feel is important to share with our listeners who have ambition to scale their own Everest, that we haven't covered?
I would tell them skip over the last 60 minutes of this and just listen to what you said. Cover what you So if you've made it this far, just if you've skipped through, you got it all right there is where it is.
That's very, very kind. I have to do these recaps in my head when I have guests. It can be frustrating for the guests because I'm working through in my own head to kind of bring this all together, so that I can come away and self-indulge, having wonderful people in front of me to kind of go, yes, that's the crystallization of the learning there. I always ask in closing, Sean, and I mean, my God, I hope I never experience the trauma that you've experienced in your life. I do hope that one day I accompany you up Kilimanjaro. I would love to do that, and you're my kind of guy in terms of somebody who I would enjoy going up there with. So, given the people that you've met in your life, given the experiences that you have encountered and overcome, can you share with our listeners three timeless takeaways?
Wow, that's a great question. Three timeless takeaways, meaning for anything.
For anything.
Don't focus on being the best, focus on being your best. That would probably be the number one. And focus on building yourself and taking care of yourself first, because if you can't give 100% to others, you're doing them an injustice, and you can't take care of others until you take care of yourself first. I guess what just popped in my mind was for the third one, live every day as though it's your last, because one day it will be.
Very, very profound. Sean, uh, it's been an absolute privilege and joy to host you on the podcast today. I tip my hat to you. It's it's incredibly humbling when you get somebody like this in front of you who has experienced so much and overcome so much, and you've given so much value to our listeners today. If people want to find out more about you, where best to go? You talked about your website. Just share that with us again.
That's the easiest question you've asked this whole time. Just go to SeanSwarner.com. Sean spelled the proper way. And Swarner,
SEAN.
correct. Sean Swarner, just like the Warner Brothers with an S. SeanSwarner.com.
SeanSwarner.com. Brilliant. And I encourage everybody to go and grab a copy of your book, Becoming Unstoppable. Tell me this. I'm sure the goal setting hasn't stopped there. What's next for you?
Ooh, well, I recently got married. I heard that's more difficult than climbing Everest.
I'll make no comment, but I'm married for more than a few decades at this stage. But yeah,
Marriage and realizing that it's not just me, it's we. Um, Kilimanjaro again for the 25th trip, and we're actually turning it into an inspedition, not an expedition. So I'm working with CEOs and executives. It's an outward adventure. It's an inward journey through an outward adventure, which is why I call it an inspedition.
love that.
Then Everest Base Camp in October, taking another group up just for fun. And these are just really inward spiritual journey. I don't want to say spiritual journey, but it just happens to be. But then maybe I'm looking, and my wife's up, so I have to keep this a little quieter. Maybe Everest next year without supplemental oxygen in my one lung, just to see if it's possible.
Incredible.
But continuing the speeches, keynote speeches, working with corporations, and utilizing my 3-week mental wellness challenge to help others break out of their mold and use their own personal core values to essentially answer the question, what if you could discover your innermost motivators so that you could accomplish your outermost goals and dreams?
Ah, there we go. There we go. You kept it for 75 minutes. We'll land the plane there. That's wonderful. Sean, well look, I wish you every success in this wonderful adventure that you call life, that you're wrapping your arms around every single minute of every single day. It's just I'm just so energized from speaking to you, and I do hope sincerely that we that I can join you in one of those expeditions sometime soon. So thank you.
Absolutely my pleasure. And when I get back to Ireland and we can go visit St. James Gate together, and then I will tell you that I'm actually Scottish, not Irish.
No, that's an expedition you want to take. Oh, brilliant. Sean, thank you so much. I love that. Love that. Thank
Thank
you.
you.